says this is a time of climate emergency and we need to act as though that is the case. So I want to share with you this evening 9 what-if questions. So you could think of this evening as being a love poem to those 2 words, which I think may be the 2 most important words in our language at the moment. How do we tell the stories about what that future could be like that create longing, that make us long for that future? It's still possible, I think, that we could create a very, very different future. If we can mobilize the energy and the brilliance of everybody to do that, I think we can still create a very different world. We could still create cities that are biodiverse and rich with wildlife. We could create cities where food grows everywhere. And our children walk to and from school through gardens and food being grown and cooked. That is entirely possible. And the human imagination is an extraordinary thing. Researchers take a group of people, and half of the people learn to play a sequence of notes on a piano, and the other half sit in front of a piano and imagine themselves playing the piano. And at the end, they're almost as good as each other at playing the piano. When some people exercise a muscle and other people imagine they're exercising that muscle, by the end, they're almost the same improvement in that muscle. But I worry that in 2019 our imagination is not as strong a muscle as it should be. In 2011, a researcher in America published a study where she looked at a test just like you did with the paper cup, which has been done back as far as the 1960s with lots and lots of people in the US. And her conclusion was that imagination and IQ rose together until the mid-1990s. And then they separated. IQ kept rising and imagination went into what she called a steady and persistent decline. So when this was published, it was on the front page of Newsweek magazine. And the article said, what does this mean for economic growth? What does this mean for Hollywood? But I never heard anyone in the climate change, social justice world say, what does this mean for us? And then I kept reading people I really admire who said, climate change is a failure of the imagination. And then they would just go off and talk about something else. And I was like, whoa, that was really interesting. So that's what I've been looking at for the last 2 years. Failure of the imagination. One of the reasons she gave for why she thought that we had a problem was because of the decline of play, the fall of play. So play, when it used to be, when I was a child, children played outside all the time. And children had a whole culture of games and stories and secret languages and songs and places that adults didn't even know existed. And play like this teaches children to cooperate. It teaches them to manage conflict. And if we raise children who don't take risks, we produce adults who don't take risks. But what we increasingly give, but play has become something that we consume rather than something that we do. You give a child a pile of leaves and some sticks and they can turn that into anything in the universe. One of the things that I found really fascinating when I started looking into this question of the imagination was about this little part of our brain called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is really fascinating. It's where our memory and our imagination fire from. But they are also it's also the part of our brain that is uniquely vulnerable to cortisol. When we are anxious or frightened or traumatized, the hippocampus can shrink by up to 20%. When it shrinks, we lose the ability to see the future in positive and hopeful way. And many researchers say that we now live in the age of anxiety, which creates the perfect conditions for our imaginations to shrink. But the point is that spending time in nature can be deeply, deeply transformative. But we live in a time when the amount of biodiversity around us is shrinking very fast. In my lifetime, the number of creatures that we share this planet with has fallen by 60%. I think living in a time where we know that that is happening gives us a state of sort of low-level anxiety and heartbreak. The microbiologist René Dubos used to say, if we lived on the moon, our imagination would be as barren as the moon. So when we live in a world where the diversity of the natural world is shrinking, I think that really is very damaging for our imagination. But we can reconnect with nature and do extraordinary things as well, I think. So I think if we want to rebuild the collective imagination, we need to be spending more time in nature and bringing nature back into our everyday life as much as we can. So I think there's something really, really important about this idea that we take the future that lies ahead of us just over there, and we bring it into the future, we bring it into the present. And when I think about what would it feel like to live in a time when anything felt possible, I think about 1968 in Paris. And there's some beautiful kind of oral histories from people who were students at that time. And one of them said, Paris was wonderful then. Everyone was talking. So that's what we do in the transition movement, basically. Is to try and work with that spirit of possibility. To say that we were not alive during the time of the suffragettes. I was not alive during the time when Martin Luther King walked across the bridge in Selma. But I know that I am alive now in the time of the climate emergency. And this is the time when we can create something utterly extraordinary and completely remarkable that future generations will tell great stories about. He says, we all, adults and children, have an obligation to daydream. We have an obligation to imagine. It is easy to pretend that nobody can change anything, that we live in a world where society is huge and the individual is less than nothing. But the truth is, individuals change their world over and over. Individuals make the future, and they do so by imagining things can be different.